territory it had gained. Japan's aircraft industry was not keeping up with even these modest demands. The result was a dramatic shortage of aircraft making their way to the fleet. Here at the edge of the sword, in Nagumo's own force, the effects were obvious. When the war had opened, Kid Butai's air groups had been full strength, although without as many spare aircraft as would have been optimal. But by June 1942, the situation had deteriorated. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Akagi had carried 66 aircraft. Now she had just 54. Kaga had been cut from 75 to 63. Soryu and Hiryu had come down from 63 apiece to 54 apiece. Nominally, each squadron, fighter, bomber and torpedo bomber, should have been allotted 3 spare aircraft for a total of 9 per ship. None were now carried by any ship in Kid Butai, and Kaga was the only ship that still retained an oversized squadron of 27 torpedo bombers. The rest of the ships were all operating 18 aircraft squadrons, with no spares. In a nutshell, each of the Kid Butai carriers had suffered a 16% decrease in their fighting power since December. Any casualties to the operating air groups, even damaged aircraft, would immediately impact the tactical cohesion of the air units, since there were no spare aircraft to feed into the formations. However, in addition to the organic air strength of the carriers themselves, Kid Butai also had guests along for the operation. Each carrier in the force was ferrying Zeros of the 6th Air Group, 6th Kokutai, often abbreviated simply 6th K, which were intended as the future garrison of Midway. 12 of these fighters were on board Junyo with the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, but the remainder were assigned to Nagumo's carriers. Akagi carried 6, Spacious Kaga hosted 9, and Hiryu and Soryu carried 3 apiece. These aircraft were stowed fully assembled because the reduction in Kid Butai's own air groups had made space available in the hangars. The 6th Q aviators had been welcomed warmly. Some of them were carrier-qualified pilots who could participate in combat activities in a pinch. Nagumo thus had a grand total of 248 aircraft aboard his ships. By way of comparison, Kid Butai's 6 carriers had brought around 412 aircraft to the Pearl Harbor operation. Nagumo was thus fighting the decisive battle with only 60% of the air power he might reasonably have expected to use as recently as May. If the aircraft situation was threadbare in the front-line carriers, it was far worse in the second-line carrier divisions. They were scraping up pilots and aircraft in any way they could to try and cobble together air groups, yet in most cases were falling short. Junyo's case is illustrative. Recently commissioned, she was designed to carry 54 aircraft. Her dive bomber group seems to have been reasonably intact and was composed of 15 Type 99 aircraft. Her fighter group, however, was another matter. It was still in the midst of being activated and was in complete disarray. 12 of the 18 Zeros on board ship were actually aircraft from the 6th Q. Yet 6th Q was itself 3 planes and several pilots short of its nominal 36-plane establishment, the remaining 21 aircraft being with Nagumo. Not only that, but 6th Q apparently didn't have enough aviators to man its own aircraft, nor could Junyo's aviators fill all the gaps. Indeed, Junyo's air group for the battle contained only 5 of its own pilots. The remainder were 4 6th Q pilots, a trio of aviators, one of whom was fresh out of flight school, on temporary attached duty, TAD, from Shokaku, and 2 more TAD flyers from Ryujo. At the same time, though, Junyo had sent one of her own fighter pilots, Tad, over to Soryu. Taken together, this meant that Junyo probably only carried 33 aircraft into battle. The point to be made is obvious. Not only was Junyo under strength, but also her fighter group at least was composed of men who did not know each other and who had never exercised together even once. The same was true for all the second-line carriers. Ryujo was carrying 30 aircraft of her 48 nominal, Zuiho 24 out of 30. And Hosho a mere 8 obsolete biplanes. In a word, after 6 months of war, the Japanese carrier force was tired. It needed rest, refit and replenishment of its air groups. it needed additional training. Above all, it needed time for the anemic Japanese aircraft industry to catch up to the demands of a full-scale war. For a navy supposedly on the top of its game, the air groups were going into the decisive battle in a decidedly shabby fashion, fatigued and desperately short of aircraft. Yet the men were counting on playing the same game they had played against the Allies for the first 6 months of the conflict, using their own superb aviators against inferior enemy pilots and planes. It had always worked before. Why not now as well? The problem, as some of the men must have suspected, was that they might be going back to the well once too often, and with too small a bucket. After 29th of May, the Japanese air groups did not participate in any further training. The Hikotai, other than patrol aircraft from the duty carriers, were stood down for final maintenance. The weather had been good for the first several days, and the eastward passage had been generally bland and unhurried. But as 1st June wore away, the weather began to turn, and Nagumo's force headed into hurrying clouds and a grey overcast. An observer hovering high over Midway on the morning of 2nd of June 1942 would have beheld a fascinating sight. Swarming over the horizon to the west and northwest were numerous Japanese naval task forces, most of which were converging on the tiny atoll below. Foremost among these was Nagumo's task force, followed at a distance of several hundred miles by Yamamoto's main body. The Aleutians' forces were already headed into the seemingly never-ending fog and overcast that surrounded their objectives. Almost due west of Midway, Tanaka's invasion force was flanked by Kondo and Kurita's battle groups. Ahead of them, the individual submarines of the cordon lines were picking their way toward their posts in solitary stealth. As far as the Japanese could tell, despite Nagumo's late departure, all was still going according to Yamamoto's design. Yet a further glance over the shoulder would have revealed a shocking sight. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown, had already sailed from Pearl Harbor and were even now poised for battle to the northeast of Midway. The events that led to the disclosure of Japan's designs at Midway to the enemy need only a brief retelling here. Just as American cryptographic prowess had allowed the U.S. Navy to thwart Inoue's thrust into the Coral Sea, so too it had revealed Yamamoto's intentions concerning Midway. As a result, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was given enough warning, just barely, to assemble his forces in time to defend the island. It was a near-run thing, but the Americans showed great ingenuity and determination in using their more limited assets to the greatest possible effect. Nimitz had no clear idea as to Japanese intentions until very late in the game. It was not until 9th of May that American intelligence began suspecting that operations might be afoot in the Central Pacific, perhaps in the form of a raid against Hawaii. Around the same time, the American code-breaking station in Hawaii, known as HIPO, became aware of a forthcoming campaign that would demand the services of many battleships, carriers, and screening destroyers. Furthermore, after the mysterious operation, these forces were going to be reassembled at Saipan, which in turn indicated that the preceding operation would occur in the Central Pacific. At the same time, traffic analysis was recording an increase in message traffic between Akagi and subordinate commands like Ep.4. In the eyes of Hypo, Midway became the logical place for such an operation. Nimitz himself was playing a dangerous game with his own superior, the demanding Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King remained nervous about a renewed Japanese offensive in the South Pacific, which his own intelligence chiefs were convinced remained the main objective of the Imperial Navy. Even before the Battle of Coral Sea, he had ordered Nimitz to commit Enterprise and Hornet to the region. Now, with Lexington sunk and Yorktown damaged, he wanted to keep them there. Nimitz, however, had confidence in the analysis of his intelligence staff and was determined to bring his carriers back to Pearl. In a daring move, Nimitz ordered Vice Admiral William Halsey, in an eyes-only communique to the latter aboard Enterprise, to deliberately expose his force to the Japanese. On the morning of 17th of May, Task Force 16 was sighted by a Japanese flying boat operating out of Tulagi. Hypo duly intercepted Japanese messages raising the alarm about American carriers, allowing Nimitz to use Halsey's manufactured sighting as reason to cancel his current mission and order Enterprise and Hornet back to Hawaii. Meanwhile, Nimitz and Hypo still needed a breakthrough that would definitely confirm Midway as Japan's near-term objective. Nimitz's cryptographers devised an ingenious stratagem to divine the location of the attack. On 19th of May, on instructions from Hypo, Midway's radio station broadcast in clear that the island's desalinization plant had broken down. Just 1 day later, the Americans broke a Japanese message giving the objective's call sign, MI, and indicating that a watership should accompany the occupation forces. The Americans now definitely knew that Midway was the target of the forthcoming Japanese offensive. While the timing of the operation was still in doubt, the first cornerstone of Yamamoto's plan, the element of strategic surprise, had been irretrievably lost. Another of Yamamoto's fundamental assumptions that the US Navy would need to be coaxed into battle was erroneous as well. In fact, Nimitz was spoiling for a fight. His beliefs mirrored Yamamoto's in at least one regard. The most effective way to win the war was to bring the enemy's carriers to battle and defeat them. Nimitz's willingness to fight rested on two assumptions. First, he was convinced that his commanders and crewmen, as demonstrated in the Coral Sea battles, were the match of their Japanese opposite numbers. Second, Nimitz believed that his advantage in strategic intelligence would allow his forces to ambush Kido Butai. Now his only problem was finding the necessary numbers of carriers. Hypo's estimates indicated that the Japanese would launch their attack with 4 or 5 flat tops, probably operating in 2 groups. Nimitz had to figure out how to roughly match their numbers. The US Navy had begun the war with 7 carriers. One of these, Ranger, was no longer deemed fit for frontline service. This left 6 fleet units: Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet and Wasp. The Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Wasp was currently engaged in the Mediterranean, ferrying British Spitfires to Malta, although she had been ordered to move to the Pacific immediately thereafter. Saratoga, having been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on 11th of January, had been repairing and refitting on the west coast, and as of the end of May was still furiously putting together her air group and collecting enough escorts to sail. She would not be able to reach Pearl Harbor until 7th June. American intelligence estimates had the Japanese opening operations against Midway as early as 2nd of June, meaning that their own carriers would need to be in position off the island by the 1st. Saratoga was therefore out of the picture. This left the Yorktown-class carriers available to contest Japanese moves. Unfortunately, Yorktown herself had been badly damaged by bombs during the same battle that had claimed the Lexington at Coral Sea. Trailing a slick of oil from storage tanks that had been cracked as a result of a near miss, she had limped back to Pearl Harbor, arriving the same day Nagumo had sorted. Yet her presence in the coming Midway operation was absolutely vital. Although Nimitz was willing to do it, he knew that pitting just 2 American carriers against 4 of their Japanese opposite numbers was an extremely risky proposition, even with Midway-based aircraft backing them up. But with the addition of a 3rd flight deck, the US Navy could match the Japanese in total numbers of aircraft. It was essential that Yorktown be returned to working order as soon as possible. In contrast with the Japanese lack of urgency about getting Zuikaku back into action, the Americans had moved heaven and earth on Yorktown's behalf. Returning to Pearl Harbor on 27th of May, she had first entered the repair basin, where 1,000 to 400 workmen had clambered on board and gotten to work. She was then into dry dock on the 28th. Realistically, Yorktown needed a 3-month refit. Instead, she would receive slightly more than 48 hours of emergency repairs. It was an all-hands, around-the-clock effort, with some of the personnel simply working straight through without sleep. At the same time, Yorktown received replacements of 3 of her squadrons. Saratoga's Bombing 3, VB3, took the place of Yorktown's Scouting 5, VS5. which had suffered heavy casualties at Coral Sea. Likewise, Fighting 3 largely replaced VF-42, and Torpedo 3 replaced VT-5. The fact that the Americans could insert replacement air groups into a carrier that they had never served aboard, while the Japanese hadn't even attempted a similar operation with the surviving aircraft from Shokaku that had already been sitting in Zuikaku, gives testimony to the superior organizational skills that the US Navy was already beginning to draw upon in the conflict. By 0900 on 30th of May, Yorktown headed back to sea, forming the core of American Task Force 17. She carried 76 aircraft 25 F-4F fighters, 37 SBD dive bombers, and 14 TBD torpedo bombers. With Yorktown went 2 heavy cruisers, Astoria and Portland, and 5 destroyers, Hammond, Hughes, Morris, Anderson, and Russell. Yorktown's 2 sister ships, Enterprise and Hornet, had sortied the day before as Task Force 16. Enterprise carried 78 aircraft, 27 F-4F fighters, 37 SBD dive bombers, and 14 TBD torpedo bombers. Hornet carried 77, 27 F-4F fighters, 35 SBD dive bombers, and 15 TBD torpedo bombers. Around them were the heavy cruisers New Orleans, Minneapolis, Vincennes, Northampton, and Pensacola, and the brand-new light cruiser Atlanta. A screen of 9 destroyers Phelps, Worden, Monaghan, Aylwin, Balk, Conyngham, Benham, Ellet, and Maury completed the force. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, flying his flag in Yorktown, would have tactical command of the carrier striking forces, as well as direct control over TF-17. He was a veteran of much action already in the war, having been at sea since the commencement of hostilities. Fletcher was a careful commander, and certainly somewhat more cautious than his counterpart Halsey. He had been taught some lessons in this regard at the Battle of Coral Sea just prior. Much like Admiral Takagi, the American commander had struck an aggressive blow against what he presumed to be the main Japanese task force, only to discover that he had launched an all-out attack against the light carrier Shoho. While sinking her was useful, it had been something of a waste and had left Fletcher's own forces exposed. It was an error he did not intend to repeat. By rights, Fletcher's senior officer in Task Force 16 should have been Vice Admiral Halsey, who had commanded the forces centered on Enterprise since the beginning of the war. However, Halsey had recently contracted shingles, making it impossible for him to sleep. As a result, upon returning to Pearl, he was immediately placed on medical leave, leaving a gap in the command structure. Nimitz asked Halsey for his recommendation for a replacement, and to Nimitz's great surprise, he nominated his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Spruance was not a carrier man and had never commanded a mixed task force before. Nevertheless, Halsey had such complete confidence in his abilities that Nimitz was persuaded that Spruance would make a sound choice. It is ironic that the hot-tempered and profane Halsey had such utter faith in a man so completely his opposite. Spruance was a very cool customer. A man defined almost totally by his intellect, he was articulate, careful, methodical, and extremely attentive to detail. Upon assuming command of Task Force 16, he wasn't overawed by his own lack of knowledge regarding naval aviation. But he also had the intellectual honesty to be aware of his shortcomings, and he took rapid steps to fill in the gaps. As events were to prove, he was also aggressive, calculating, and a commander who would not panic in adversity. Altogether, the American carriers brought 233 aircraft to the fight, just 15 fewer than Nagumo's carrier force. However, the American carriers had much less experience in joint operations than did the Japanese. Furthermore, Task Force 16 and 17 intended to fight separately, often out of eyesight of each other, making coordination problematic. It was hoped, however, that dispersal would make it more difficult for the Japanese to detect and attack all of the American carriers simultaneously. Nimitz had not been idle in reinforcing Midway's own air strength. Commanded by Captain Cyril T. Simard, Midway was currently operating 4 squadrons, composed of 31 PBY Catalina patrol planes. These planes were aggressively pushing reconnaissance flights out to 700 miles from the atoll. By 4th June, Eastern Islands airstrip was stuffed to the rafters with another 96 aircraft of all sorts, including Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Force attack planes. There was a squadron of 17 B-17 heavy bombers, as well as a foursome of B-26 medium bombers fitted for carrying torpedoes. The Marines had contributed a squadron of 21 old Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 7 F-4F Wildcats, and a squadron of 19 SBD dive bombers and 21 older SB-2U scout bombers. The Navy brought in a detachment of 6 brand-new TBF torpedo planes and a light utility plane. In all, 127 U.S. aircraft were temporarily calling Midway home. The increase in the numbers and range of patrols, as well as the much larger air group at the base, meant that by 1st June the base's aviation fuel consumption had exploded to 65,000 gallons daily, against a total of about 150,000 gallons of Avgas storage on the island. Keeping the air station supplied with fuel was quickly becoming a problem. Nimitz placed his forces brilliantly, ordering Fletcher to hold his carriers some 300 miles to the northeast of Kido Butai's anticipated axis of advance, from this otherwise indistinguishable spot of ocean, named Point Luck, 32N 173W. His carriers would be in a position to ambush the Japanese after the enemy launched their aircraft against Midway. By steering clear of the waters south of the island, he was well positioned to avoid any possible entanglements with the various advancing Japanese formations. Here, the Americans were more exposed to attack, but they were also in a better position to launch their own surprise assault on the Japanese flank. Nimitz didn't know the exact composition of the enemy forces, but he was confident that he could give battle under favourable terms as long as he retained the element of surprise. He had also deployed a strong group of 12 American fleet boats around Midway itself, which would hopefully weaken any Japanese force and open it up to attack. Despite the boldness of his plan, Nimitz felt no need for a do-or-die effort in defence of the atoll. He expected his carrier admirals to attack aggressively but judiciously, seeking opportunities to inflict maximum damage at the minimum cost in what was termed strong attritional tactics. Under no circumstances were the carriers to be sacrificed unnecessarily. If the situation became untenable, they were to back off and let the Japanese attempt an invasion. Nimitz understood the logistical situation of the atoll better than the Japanese did themselves, knowing that he would be in a better position to retake the islands than the Japanese would be to defend it. As a result, preserving the 3 American flight decks was more important than preserving the Marine garrison there. However, the Marines had taken their own measures to ensure that if it ever came to a fight, they would be able to face the Japanese on the best terms possible. Their 6th Defence Battalion, under the energetic leadership of Colonel Harold D. Shannon, had been stiffened by the addition of 2 companies of elite Marine raiders. A platoon of light tanks had been sequestered in the tiny pine forest at the centre of Sand Island. The men had engaged in a frenzy of defensive preparations, digging multiple lines of emplacements, hardening heavy weapons sites, and clearing fields of fire across the beaches. They had laid thickets of barbed wire around their perimeters and entrenched their communications lines, and they had improvised an array of lethal explosive booby traps and mines to strew across the beaches and landing approaches. Midway's 2 islands now bristled with defences. Even a heavily supported Japanese landing would have found the going very difficult. The same was hardly true of the Japanese. Indeed, an omniscient observer would also have noticed that by this time the Japanese strategic scouting plan for Operation MI had fallen completely to pieces. The submarine cordon lines, upon which Nagumo was counting for early warning of northward advancing Americans, were tardy in taking their positions, having left Kwajalein late. But even had they left on time, they would have missed the American carriers. By the time Cordon A and B were established, the Americans had already slipped past it. The reasons for the failure of the submarine picket lines, which were not properly understood until after the war, verge on the scandalous. The commander of 6th Fleet, Japan's submarine forces, was Vice Admiral Marquis Komatsu Teruhisa, the cousin of the Empress of Japan and a close personal friend of Emperor Hirohito. The Marquis was a great fan of Yamamoto's and had such confidence in the Midway operation that in his opinion the battle was as good as won. So much so, in fact, that he was already preoccupied with follow-up plans to attack the Panama Canal and terrorize California. He thus paid little attention to the nuts and bolts of the deployment against Midway. While he was supposed to be at the staff planning sessions held on board Yamato, Komatsu did not attend, sending his staff instead. Furthermore, according to Gordon Prange, the submarine cordon details never appeared in the official orders for Operation MI. Writing up the submarine portion of such orders was a normal responsibility of Commander Arima Takayasu, Yamamoto's submarine officer. But for some reason, Captain Kuroshima told Arima that he had no need to do so. This rather incredible oversight meant that the Japanese boats were committed to action without a workable operational plan. Furthermore, the boats that were tasked for the operation, the older vessels of Subron 5, were far from ideal for the mission. None of them could dive safely past 200 feet, and all of them were under refit during the April-May period, with the intent of being shortly moved into the reserve fleet and relegated to training purposes. Not surprisingly, Commander Yura Shojiya of Naval GHQ's submarine staff protested to Admiral Fukudome that the boats were too slow and bulky to get on station in a timely manner, nor could they cope with air attacks and patrols once they got there. His protests fell on deaf ears. As matters developed, Yura was completely correct in his estimation of Subron 5's weaknesses. Their overhauls took too long, and the boats were late in leaving Kwajalein, departing between 26 and 30 May. Worse yet, the long daylight hours, coupled with intensifying American patrol activity, meant that the boats had only limited time during the night to transit on the surface. During the days they were often forced to dive to avoid Catalinas, creeping forward submerged as best they could. The result was that while the boats were scheduled to be in place by 1st June, local, some of them didn't reach their stations until 3rd June, by which time the American carriers had already passed through. Had the American task forces been sighted in the vicinity, Yamamoto and Nagumo would have had both actionable information and the time to make last-minute adjustments to their operational plans. As it was, they received neither. This would have been bad enough, but even worse was the fact that Admiral Komatsu was fully aware that his force had taken up their stations late, but did not relay this up the chain of command. On or about 3rd of June, Komatsu notified Admiral Yamamoto of the failure of Operation K, described shortly. However, he did not call Yamamoto's attention to the fact that his picket submarines had arrived late on station. Obviously, this was a serious oversight, if oversight it was. The net result was that not only did Yamamoto and Nagumo not know whether the American carriers had sortied toward Midway or not, they weren't even aware that they didn't know. In fact, they didn't know that there was any problem with their scouting arrangements at all. It would appear that because of Komatsu's membership in the imperial family, he was never held to account for this crucial failure. As one observer later noted, Japanese historians in later years would allude to the event only obliquely, and American historians would necessarily follow the lead of the Japanese. One example of such an oblique reference is supplied by Admiral Ugaki, who remarked after the battle in his diary that "We failed to make good use of subs in reconnaissance, despite having ordered the cordons in place to prevent the very sort of ambush that in fact occurred." Komatsu's oversights, though, might have been made good if the Japanese were willing to put some of the other pieces of the puzzle together. Indeed, as the Japanese advanced, they began receiving evidence that the Americans were wise to at least some of Yamamoto's initial deployments. On 30th of May, shortly after Admiral Tanaka's invasion force sortied from Saipan, an American submarine dead ahead had been overheard broadcasting a long coded message of an urgent nature. given that Tanaka's force was on course almost directly for its ultimate objective, it would not take much for the Americans to figure out where he was headed. In addition, the Japanese had noted via radio intercepts that an increased number of American submarines were operating in the mid-Pacific and Aleutians. Closer to the battle area, Operation K, the seaplane scouting effort aimed at assessing the status of Pearl Harbor had to be aborted on the 31st. One of the Japanese refueling subs, the I-121, approaching French frigate shoals on the 27th, had found that the previously isolated islet had now become the abode of an American seaplane tender and her destroyer consort. The Japanese submarine was shortly joined by her sister, I-123, but the Americans showed no signs of departing. On the 30th, I-123 reluctantly radioed headquarters at Kwajalein regarding the setback. Operation K was postponed for 24 hours in the vain hope that the Americans would move on the following day. However, the next morning American flying boats were now seen moored in the lagoon. French frigate Shoals was clearly an operational American seaplane base. Attacking their ships would only bring attention to the area, but without them gone, there was no way that the huge Kawanishi flying boats could refuel. Operation K had to be scrubbed, thus depriving Nagumo of any intelligence regarding the Americans' main fleet base. Submarine I-168, meanwhile, had been scouting Midway itself. Her captain, Lt. Commander Tanabe Yahachi, submitted a comprehensive report on 2 June concerning the activities he had observed there. The atoll was mounting an average of nearly 100 flights daily. The seaplanes were gone much of the daylight hours, meaning that they were patrolling aggressively out to great distances. At night, blazing work lights indicated that construction was proceeding around the clock. Midway did not appear to be a sleepy backwater unaware of its approaching fate. On the contrary, the atoll had every appearance of an outpost doubly on its guard. Commander Tanabe's reports were duly sent up the chain of command, but apparently didn't make much of an impression. Japanese radio intercept stations in Japan, Truk and Saipan, had also noticed that American radio traffic emanating from Hawaii was up. Additionally, many of the orders being sent by Nimitz to his subordinates were tagged urgent. Taken together, Japanese traffic analysis seemed to indicate that American heavy forces were probably operating at sea rather than sitting in Pearl Harbor. The question is, how much of this information actually came into Nagumo's hands as he sailed toward battle, and did he act on it? The conventional wisdom, as promulgated by Fuchida Mitsuo's post-war account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, is that Nagumo was completely in the dark regarding all of these matters except the failure of Operation K. Nagumo's own report states flatly that the Americans were not aware of Japanese plans and that his forces were not discovered until the morning of 4th June Midway time. Fuchida blamed this failure in part on Combined Fleet Staff's decision on board Yamato to not transmit information forward to Nagumo, and also on Akagi's poor communications capabilities, resulting from her allegedly small island and limited number of radio aerials. However, neither of these excuses really stands up to scrutiny. First of all, Akagi's problems with communications, if there were any, likely had less to do with the number or quality of her aerials than it did with their height above the surface of the ocean. All Japanese carriers suffered from this problem, in that they had relatively small bridge structures and mainmasts. Consequently, there were few places high in the ship to place an aerial, which in turn explains their location on the sides of the flight decks. When flight operations were underway, they were cranked into their horizontal positions, away from the flight deck and any potential accidents, thus lowering them further and hampering their use for communications. This was a known weakness of making an aircraft carrier a flagship, yet the Japanese accepted these drawbacks to exercise better local control over the task force's various air groups. However, despite these shortcomings, it is equally clear that Kido Butai's communications did not rely solely on a plan for Midway called for each ship's wireless receivers to be continuously manned and tuned to the broadcast of the 1st Communications Unit in Tokyo, which was responsible for relaying all messages received from units of combined fleet back out to the forces at sea. Each of Nagumo's 20 ships, plus the 6 ships of the supply unit, were thus continuously on the alert for communications from Tokyo, and would relay such information first to their respective unit flagships, and then on up to the force flagship, Akagi, as the need arose. In addition to listening for Tokyo's broadcasts, every vessel in Kido Butai that had sufficient receivers was also listening to enemy frequencies, hoping to intercept enemy aircraft and submarine transmissions. This latter function was the responsibility of each ship's radio direction finding RDF unit, such equipment being carried by all of the larger ships. Both Haruna and Kirishima had communications facilities befitting a capital ship, including radio aerials mounted high atop their towering mainmasts. It is known that one of Bat-Div 3's vessels, most likely Haruna, was officially designated as a backup battle force communications facility in the event of an emergency. The brand new cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, also had quite modern facilities. Even old Nagara's RDF and radio outfit had been upgraded in 1936. All in all, Kido Butai seems to have been well equipped to receive instructions from either Tokyo or Combined Fleet Headquarters, Yamato. It also mounted adequate equipment for intercepting and localizing enemy radio transmissions. Indeed, the overall problem with Japanese communications had less to do with their inability to receive information than it did with Japanese emphasis on radio silence, as well as commanders' tendencies to gloss over or equivocate regarding transmitting bad news. Without a willingness to evaluate and act on information, all the radio equipment in the world wasn't going to help Nagumo. The radio reports surrounding the failure of Operation K illustrate how the system was supposed to work. I-123's messages regarding French frigate shoals were broadcast upward to her headquarters at 6th Fleet in Kwajalein. Kwajalein, in turn, was required to keep Saipan, Truk, Wake Combined Fleet HQ at sea, and, most important, the 1st Communications Unit at Tokyo in the loop. 1st Communications Unit was then responsible for rebroadcasting pertinent information back out to the various fleet commands. This is exactly what happened on the 31st with I-123's reports. Both Fuchida and Ugaki acknowledge in their accounts that the main body received these messages. In other words, the system, with its very centralized control of communications, was working. It was successfully passing information from low-level units up the chain of communications and then back out to the various commands, although it is unclear whether Yamato received I-123's initial message, 6th Fleet's report of the incident to Tokyo, 1st Communications Unit's rebroadcast, or some mixture of these three sources. I-168's report on the 2nd regarding enemy activity at Midway was similarly received on Yamato. It is true that even with modern facilities, Kid Butai might well have suffered a communications breakdown. Merely having radios tuned to the right frequency was no guarantee that Nagumo was actually receiving the information he needed. Indeed, such failures plagued both the Japanese and Americans during the early portions of the war. However, Akagi's Air Group report provides compelling evidence that the Admiral and his staff were much better informed on the matter of American activities than the common wisdom would have us believe. Akagi's report specifically notes increased patrolling by American aircraft operating out of Midway, starting around 29th of May. It also cites the increased presence of enemy submarines whose goal was apparently reconnoitering the Japanese forces. Crucially, both of these items were described as having been derived from either radio intelligence and/or Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. More important, the report further indicates that, according to Naval General Staff Service Message Radio Intelligence of 31st May, for the last several days there has been a tendency for the number of enemy vessels participating in the Pacific Air Base Communications System and the General Ships Communications System centered at Honolulu to increase. Several aspects of Akagi's report bear elaboration. First, it is specific that the information in hand had been derived from other units, not Kid Butai. Second, the fact that it describes the conditions of the enemy on both 29 and 31 May means that this information was received by Akagi after she sailed from Hashirajima. If so, then she had to have received messages from the 1st Communications Unit. Ugaki's diary makes mention of the very same data being received on board Yamato on the 29th as well, indicating that Akagi and Nagumo were receiving Tokyo's transmissions just fine. Finally, the fact that Akagi's report describes these 3 pieces of intelligence information under the heading of enemy situation before the battle clearly implies that Nagumo had received this data prior to the engagement. The matter of the transmitting American submarine off of Saipan is interesting as well. Fuchida's account asserts that it was the radio intercept unit aboard Yamato that detected the American boat. However, Admiral Ugaki, who was actually on board Yamato at the time, mentions only that the submarine's messages had been intercepted, not by whom. Given the proximity of land-based radio equipment at the fleet base at Saipan, and the fact that Yamato had barely cleared the coast of Japan at the time the intercept was made, it would appear much more likely that Yamato's interception, if it occurred at all, was merely a supplement to a detection by Saipan's own RDF unit. Such a radio intercept would have been communicated directly to Tokyo by the 5th Communications Unit at Saipan, and thence back out to the fleet, where Nagumo would likely have received it as well. In sum, it appears likely that Nagumo was less in the dark about the Americans' alertness than has been believed. If he did not have the complete puzzle in hand, he at least had a number of the important pieces. Taking Akagi's report at face value, Nagumo should have known 3 things. First, that American patrol aircraft out of Midway were operating far afield and that the risk of detection was high. This placed the invasion forces to his south at particular risk, because Nagumo's tardy departure had, in essence, placed Tanaka 1 day ahead of where he should have been relative to Kid Butai. This, in turn, meant that Nagumo could not count on the timing of the battle unfolding as planned. Second, given the increase in enemy signal traffic, it was likely that the American fleet carriers were engaged in urgent operations somewhere in the Pacific. Third, with the failure of Operation K, he was now completely devoid of any credible intelligence on the enemy's strength and movements. The American carriers could literally be anywhere. Given no clear-cut evidence for either an optimistic or pessimistic estimate of the enemy's dispositions, a prudent commander should have planned for the worst case. The question is, why did he apparently not bother to recast his plans? At the very least, why did he not make arrangements to beef up his scouting assets so as to completely assure himself that there would be no surprises? There are a number of explanations for this. The first probably hinges on the lack of any direct information from Komatsu's tardy submarine picket line. Another factor is the general contempt in which the American forces were held at this time by the Japanese. Despite the setback at Coral Sea, the fact remained that the Japanese had reeled off an almost unbroken string of victories in the first 6 months of the war. Tired air groups and aviators notwithstanding, the Japanese, and especially the members of combined fleet staff, believed that they were better than the Americans, no matter where, when, or under what circumstances they met. Admiral Ugaki, commenting on the possibility of Tanaka's transport force having been detected sooner than planned off of Saipan, remarked in his diary that its premature discovery might lead to a showdown with the enemy force, which is rather welcome. Such an attitude of supreme confidence bespoke the general attitude throughout the fleet. Simply showing up was apparently all that was required for Nagumo to secure the victory. Whatever his faults, though, Nagumo does not come across as an arrogant man, nor does he seem to have been rash, as the following anecdote illustrates. Following the return of Kid Butai to Kyushu after its sortie into the Indian Ocean in April, a technical research conference was held at Kanoya Air Base to begin planning for the development of the Zero fighter's successor. Present were representatives from KK Hombu, the Navy Air Technical Bureau, and the Yokosuka Air Group, which was the Navy's test pilot squadron. Representatives from Kid Butai, including Nagumo, were there to provide the latest in direct combat experience. Mitsubishi's Horikoshi Jiro, the famed designer of the Zero, was present, as was Lieutenant Cadet Nagamori Yoshio, who represented the fighter airframe section from KK Hombu. Both men later report that the mood of overweening self-confidence among the airmen was palpable, especially among the fighter pilots. Any attempt at cautious analysis or measured debate tended to get pushed aside by their unlimited exuberance. After the conference, the participants attended a dinner hosted by Nagumo. The Admiral dutifully made the rounds, exchanging toasts of sake with everyone present. When he came to Nagamori, Nagumo sat down on the tatami mat and crossed his legs in front of the young lieutenant commander. According to Nagamori, Nagumo said to him quite emphatically, "Don't take what the men of the fleet tell you at face value. At times we tend to be swayed by emotion and give opinions based on the momentum of the moment. Your job is to take all factors into consideration and reach a cool and balanced conclusion." This was not a reckless individual, nor one given to being dismissive of the enemy. If true, though, what are the reasons for Nagumo's lack of initiative in terms of incorporating current intelligence into his operational planning? First of all, it is not clear that Nagumo's orders allowed him to improvise if the need arose. All the senior officers in the fleet knew that Yamamoto had not been inclined to change even the tiniest details of his grand scheme at any point during the previous 2 months of planning. Having been previously castigated by the Commander-in-Chief over his performance at Pearl Harbor, Nagumo would hardly be inclined to take matters into his own hands unless the situation clearly warranted it. The intelligence he had may have been worrisome, but that was about it. Without concrete information to act on, Nagumo may have simply judged that the wisest course was to continue with what he was doing and attend to any unpleasant realities as they arose. This rather passive, fatalistic outlook was further compounded by an institutional weakness on the part of the Japanese military toward improvisation. The truth of the matter was that an inability to change their plans in mid-stride was endemic to the Japanese military as a whole. Nagumo was emotionally and by training a creation of this military tradition. He didn't know how to improvise, and he didn't want to try. But really, why would anyone expect him to be otherwise? He was the product of a military that placed obedience above all other virtues, a military that had succeeded in snuffing out the flame of individuality in the majority of its officers, a military that for 4 years would send men to their deaths in the blindest, most stupid ways imaginable. For a Western historian, this is one of the most maddening aspects of the Japanese Navy to contemplate, that in many cases the Japanese almost seemed to view defeat and their own deaths as the easier option to take, rather than shouldering the mental burden of having to reason their way out of unanticipated problems. Nagumo, despite his exalted position and responsibility, in the final analysis behaved as he ought to have behaved, by acting as the unquestioning tool of a supreme commander who was himself a demonstrated autocrat. Whatever Nagumo's failings as an operational leader, the final responsibility for his unwillingness to improvise must be laid firmly at the feet of the man whose flawed strategic outlook had created the mess in the first place, and the military culture that had let all of this occur. On the morning of 2nd June, 1st June for the American forces, the weather around Kid Butai began to worsen noticeably. By 1000, the force was beset by fog, which worsened through the day, until by evening Nagumo's ships were shrouded in an impenetrable white cloud. The situation was no better on the morning of the 3rd. All the ships streamed buoys aft, so that the vessels following them would be able to determine if they were overhauling a hidden ship in front. Yet the ships still had to attempt to zigzag, and keeping station was a nightmare. Akagi's navigator, Commander Gishiro Miura, was a bundle of nerves but tried to effect a casual air by padding about the bridge in his slippers. His tiny 3x4-foot map table was now the centre of Akagi's world, as he strained to keep the flagship heading in the right direction while fretting about what the other ships might be doing out there in the gloom. On the right side of the bridge, clustered around the 15-centimetre spotting glasses, Nagumo and his staff tried to stay out of the way. Nagumo stared out the windows into the opaque white walls surrounding him. Occasionally, one of the force's escorts would heave momentarily into view at the apex of a zigzag, but then was almost immediately lost to sight again. Nagumo's anxiety was high. He was scheduled to change course southeast this morning to begin the final approach to the objective. In normal conditions, this would be executed with ease, but visual communications were now almost out of the question. Waiting until the appointed hour arrived, and then trusting that every ship in the task force would simply execute a smooth turn to starboard was a fool's hope. A collision was almost guaranteed. Some sort of positive action had to be taken to assure the coordination of the force, or Kid Butai might not make its designated flying-off spot in time. However, the fleet was currently steaming under a formal state of absolute radio silence, condition Tesekar. As such, radio transmission was only authorized in emergencies where operations required it. Under this condition, Nagumo alone was empowered to make decisions regarding the usage of the fleet's radios. On the bridge, the situation was tense as Nagumo and his staff debated what to do. Kusaka's deputy, Captain Oishi, was in favor of sticking to the schedule, but in the next breath he noted that the entire invasion schedule was dependent on attacking Midway on 5th of June. Nagumo finally came down in favor of venturing a radio transmission. At 10:30, the order was given over Akagi's medium frequency set. At 1200 hours, change to course 100 degrees. Nagumo and 1st Air Fleet staff fervently hoped that the Americans would not be the wiser to their low-power broadcast. There was no way of telling, of course, whether the enemy was now alerted to their plans. At noon, Nagumo's force made its appointed turn. Almost immediately, as if in mockery, the weather began to clear. Kid Butai's thirsty destroyers, which had been forced to suspend fueling activities the previous day, at once began sidling up to their designated oilers. Fueling went slowly, and the force still encountered heavy intermittent fog banks. Nevertheless, it seemed that the worst of the weather was behind them. Meanwhile, far to the south, this day had not been without complications for Tanaka's invasion force, as the Americans had become aware of his approach. At 08:43 on the 4th, a PBY Catalina had stumbled across Captain Miyamoto's minesweeper group. About 45 minutes later, a different PBY had sighted Admiral Tanaka's group, which was at that point almost 700 miles due west from the atoll. Initially misidentified by the American pilot as the Japanese main body, it took until nearly 1100 for Midway's air commander to satisfy himself that Tanaka's force did not, in fact, contain the Japanese heavy units. Nevertheless, it was a significant enough force to be worth attacking. Accordingly, 9 B-17s from the 431st Bombardment Squadron were dispatched against Tanaka shortly after noon. The bombers took more than 4 hours to reach Tanaka, arriving overhead at 16:23. For all the formidable reputation that Japanese lookouts were to develop in subsequent engagements, this one did them little credit because the Americans were able to set up their initial runs at altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, without the transports arrayed neatly below them, apparently being aware of their presence. Only at the last minute, with bombs exploding around them, did the Japanese vessels realize their peril and begin jinking to avoid the incoming ordnance. As luck would have it, no hits were scored on any of Tanaka's charges. The Japanese force quickly put up a hasty, heavy anti-aircraft barrage, but it did no good. After about 10 minutes overhead, the American aircraft withdrew. Tanaka promptly radioed news of his encounter out to combined fleet. The morning of 4th June had also seen the detachment of the supply force from Kid Butai. The 5 oilers concluded their refueling activities at 0307, roughly 0507 local, and they and destroyer Akigumo departed the formation, steaming south at 12 knots. Thereafter, Kid Butai kept ready-duty fighters on deck because they were now within range of American patrols. 2.5 hours later, Akagi's signal lamps began blinking out the following day's strike mission to the force, which called for Midway to be struck at dawn. At 10:25 ship's time, Nagumo followed up with orders concerning the fleet's anticipated movements after the strike force was in the air. Shortly afterward, the force increased speed to 24 knots. They would steam at high speed for the rest of the day and through the night to close on the objective in time for the following morning's launch. Finally, at 15:30 ship's time, Nagumo blinkered detailed signals to the fleet regarding the search activities to be undertaken on 5th June. The reconnaissance program, as conceived by Commander Gender, was simple and direct. 7 aircraft would fly a series of spoke-shaped searches out from the fleet, principally on the exposed eastern and southern flanks. The number 1 and number 2 search lines, being 181 and 154 degrees, were to be flown by torpedo aircraft from Akagi and Kaga, respectively. Heavy cruiser Tone's aircraft were tasked with searching down lines number 3 and number 4, 123 and 100 degrees. To do this, she would use 2 E-13A1 Type 0 reconnaissance seaplanes. In addition, she would contribute an E-8N2 Type 95 to the task force's anti-submarine patrol. Chikuma would do likewise with one of her Type 95s and use 2 more Type 0s to search lines number 5 and number 6, 77 and 54 degrees respectively. Line number 7, 31 degrees, would be run by a Type 95 seaplane from Haruna. Each of the recon planes except Haruna's was assigned to fly their line for 300 miles before making a port turn for 60 miles. At the completion of the dogleg, each plane would return to the task force. Haruna's Type 95 seaplane would only search out for 150 miles before making its 40-mile dogleg and then homing. The primary criticism levelled against Gender's search plan, that it was more of a rubber stamp than an honest attempt to assess if an enemy was truly at hand, is certainly warranted. This is a point that has been hammered home in every Western book on the battle, though it was first brought to light by Fuchida. His views on the topic are worth stating at length, since they comprise the bulk of an argument that has been picked up on by historians ever since. Although the coverage appeared adequate, I still felt that a 2-phase search would have been wiser. A single-phase search might be sufficient if we wished only to confirm our assumption that no enemy fleet was in the vicinity. However, if we recognized the possibility that this assumption might be wrong and that an enemy force might be present, our searches should have been such as to assure that we could locate and attack it before it could strike at us. For this purpose, a 2-phase dawn search was the logical answer. As the term indicates, a 2-phase search employs 2 sets of planes which fly the same search lines, with a given time interval between them. Since our planes were not equipped with radar at this time, they were completely reliant on visual observation and could search effectively only by daylight. Consequently, to spot an enemy force as soon as possible after dawn, it was necessary to have one set of planes, the first phase, launched in time to reach the end of their search radius as day was breaking. This meant that the areas traversed in darkness on their outbound flight remained unsearched. Hence, a second-phase search was required over these same lines by planes taking off about 1 hour later. Men assigned to the first phase of such a search obviously had to be well trained in night flying. Nagumo had such pilots and could have used this method, but it would have required twice as many planes as a single-phase search. Despite the importance of conducting adequate searches, our naval strategists were congenitally reluctant to devote more than a bare minimum of their limited plane strength to such missions. 10% of total strength was all they were willing to spare for search operations, feeling that the rest should be reserved for offensive use. But such overemphasis on offensive strength had proven detrimental to our purposes before this, and it would again. Naturally enough, Admiral Nagumo was eager to devote maximum strength to the Midway attack and did not want to use any more planes for search than seemed absolutely necessary. Since he had no reason to suspect that presence of an enemy force in the area, he was satisfied that a single-phase search was adequate precaution against the unexpected. Fushida's diagnosis of the problem is largely correct, but his prescription, a two-phase search, is based completely on hindsight derived from later war experience. In fact, at this stage in the conflict, a two-phase search was totally unknown, and single-phase searches were the only kind of search plans there were. It would not be until May 1943 that Combined Fleet would formally incorporate two-phase searches into its doctrine, largely as the result of lessons learned at Midway and in the Solomon Islands. For Fuchida to assign blame to Nagumo and Genda for somehow failing to apprehend an ostensibly obvious solution that was not even a part of contemporary Japanese naval doctrine is clearly unfair. A truly honest assessment of the Japanese reconnaissance plan must begin by discarding this non sequitur and analysing what could reasonably be accomplished within the framework of the doctrine, search assets, and meteorological conditions that pertained on 5 June 1942. Fuchida is correct in pointing out that Japanese carrier doctrine, like their naval doctrine as a whole, was almost purely offensive-minded. Any reduction of the carrier attack squadrons to perform scouting missions was ipso facto looked upon as something of a waste. As such, Japanese carriers had no formally established search units on board. Conversely, of course, the Japanese clearly needed to make sure that their offensive firepower was being fully employed against the right targets, thereby making sound scouting essential to the success of the operation. On the face of it, it would appear that the reconnaissance effort could have been undertaken without the carrier's help. After all, battleships Haruna and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, and the light cruiser Nagara all carried reconnaissance floatplanes. In fact, the Japanese had developed heavy cruisers like Tone and Chikuma precisely for the purpose of offloading scouting duties from the carriers. Unfortunately, the majority of the floatplanes in the fleet were actually ill-suited for long-range reconnaissance. Tone and Chikuma nominally carried 5 aircraft apiece, 3 Type 0 floatplanes and 2 Type 95. The 2 battleships of Ep.4 were equipped with 3 Type 95s as well. Nagara, in her role as a destroyer flotilla flagship, was most likely carrying one of the rather rare Aichi 11A1 night reconnaissance seaplanes. Unfortunately, whereas the newer Type 0 floatplanes had a range of over 1,100 miles, the Type 95 was limited to 485. Developed in the mid-1930s, it was really more of a spotting plane, used for correcting the fall of shot from a battleship or heavy cruiser, than a true search aircraft. At the time it was designed, carrier-borne aircraft barely had the ability to strike over the horizon. Now they could attack from more than 200 miles away. The Type 95 simply did not have the range necessary to detect enemies before they were within striking distance. Similarly, Nagara's plane was intended for night work and wouldn't have been used during the day in any case. Thus, the Type 0 floatplanes were the only decent reconnaissance floatplanes in the fleet, and only 5 of these appear to have been available. If carrier aircraft weren't used, Nagumo's scouting assets were slim indeed. The other factor to consider was the weather and the size of the battle area. If a rectangle were laid over the extremes of the Japanese search plan, it would cover more than 176,000 square miles, an area larger than Sweden. The weather conditions would not be uniform across this space, meaning that each aircraft's sighting range would vary. Come the morrow, Kid Butai would be trailing just behind the leading edge of a strong, cold front moving down from the northwest. The front would be demarcated by lines of cumulus clouds, squalls and showers. The heavy weather and fog that Nagumo's force had ploughed through on the 2nd and 3rd was now behind them, but it was also continuing to follow them down from the northwest. The weather to their north and northeast was therefore likely to be poor for scouting. Furthermore, as the front moved down, it was pushing scattered clouds into the area in a broad east-west band that would gird the middle of the battlefield, making scouting to the east more challenging as well. Only to the south was the weather likely to open up a bit. At Kid Butai's launch position, the conditions were a mixed bag. Behind the front, they would be sailing beneath bands of broken clouds, with ceilings of between 1,000 and 3,000 feet. This offered the force excellent concealment. However, as events would prove, more clouds than sky would be visible, making detection of incoming aircraft more difficult. Before the days of radar, scout aircraft, on both sides, flew at relatively low altitudes, typically between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. There were several reasons for this. First, it was difficult to spot submarines at higher altitudes, and spotting submarines was an important part of any scout's job. Second, staying low gave the scout a better chance to evade hostile aircraft because it could dive for the deck and thereby avoid being attacked from below. Third, and most important, scouting at low altitude allowed the horizon to be used as a mechanism for scanning for ship profiles. In fact, flying at high altitude was often counterproductive for spotting ships below if patchy cloud conditions were prevalent, whereas breaks in the clouds allowed good visibility directly under the aircraft. Those gaps disappeared toward the horizon as the angle of view from the aircraft became shallower, making even patchy cloud cover appear to be an unbroken blanket at longer ranges. The end result was that scout aircraft had visual ranges that were relatively limited to begin with because of their altitude, and that could be impacted significantly by local weather conditions. With the above in mind, it is clear that Genda's plan suffered from a twofold failure. The first had nothing to do with the hypothetical phasing of the search. Rather, it was the sheer number of aircraft being devoted to the initial sweep. Put simply, 7 planes could not reconnoitre an area the size of Sweden. By way of comparison, the US Navy was not only planning on devoting the 31 PBYs based at Midway for scouting duties, but could call on 3 squadrons of armed Dauntless dive bombers, 56 aircraft in all, from their carriers in an armed scout role as well. The PBYs by themselves would outnumber Japanese scout aircraft by more than 4 to 1. Genda wrote post-war that it has to be admitted that the planning of the air searching was slipshod. Although the plan was a repeat of the search missions used at Pearl Harbor and Indian Ocean, Genda went on to elaborate that this plan involved a defect of leaving an uncovered space in the search area, especially when an enemy force moved across or slantwise of the planned search arc. The search plan should have been made more mathematically and precisely. Genda might have also added the word flexibly to his list of desirable attributes. Mathematically precise or not, the search scheme was completely divorced from the realities of the weather conditions that would likely pertain on 5th June. Having just traversed a front of very bad weather, it should have been apparent to Nagumo's staff that more aircraft would be needed. When the likely spotting ranges of the Japanese aircraft are superimposed over the tracks that they, nominally, flew, the basic problem is immediately apparent. There were serious gaps in the coverage. As such, it might have been wise to hold a few aircraft in reserve to blanket those vectors with lower visibility conditions. The success of Genda's plan depended on having decent weather everywhere, alert crews, and nearly perfect timing on the part of all the planes involved to ensure that their very tightly defined routes were adequately reconnoitred. If these arrangements were thrown off in any way, then detection of the enemy might be tardy. Genda, better than anyone in the fleet, had a sense for what Kid Butai's operational cycles were like. As events were to prove, the first carrier striking force possessed many laudable military assets, but operational flexibility did not figure prominently in its portfolio of strengths. Genda should have had a sense that, faced with a suddenly emerging threat, the Japanese carrier force would not be able to simply drop what it was doing and turn to face the new opponent, particularly if it was already heavily engaged against Midway. It was absolutely critical to ensure that the force had the time necessary to react. If that meant making a down payment of striking power and devoting Keiga's extra Cheitai of 9 Type 97 Kank to the problem of covering the eastern flank of the force, then so be it. Even an extra 3 aircraft on that flank could have changed the aspect of Genda's search from Swiss cheese to at least a medium cheddar. but Genda didn't think he'd need these extra aircraft. Instead, he opted to cut his scouting margin to nothing and reserve as much offensive firepower as he could. Here is where the false economy of Genda's plan is made clear. By not being willing to sacrifice a fairly marginal number of aircraft for scouting duties, Genda had implicitly forfeited the fleet's ability to buy time for itself. As for the dawn strike against Midway itself, it was to take off at 04:30 and comprise 108 aircraft total. Cardiff 2 would contribute its entire contingent of 36 Type 97s acting as level bombers. These planes would lead the attack from the east and thereby gaining the advantage of having the sun at their backs. Hiryu's aircraft were tasked with bombing Sand Island's facilities. SRIs would attend to Eastern Island and its airfield. Once the initial wave of high-level attacks was concluded, the dive bombers would move in. Cardiff 1 would contribute 36 bombers from both of its flight decks. Akagi's 18 were slated to attack Eastern Island, with Kaga's hitting Sand Island. The remainder of the attack force, a strong contingent of 36 Zero fighters, had a twofold mission. The first, obviously, was to safely shepherd the attack aircraft to the target and destroy or disperse any enemy fighters that got in the way. Then, having achieved air superiority over the objective, the Zeros would strafe any enemy aircraft on the ground. On the face of it, this was a fairly powerful strike force, but in fact, it was marginal to the task at hand. Midway, for all its diminutive size, actually possessed an aircraft contingent nearly as large as the attacking Japanese force. Not only that, but its base facilities were strongly defended. The 36 Zeros in the fighter escort could provide little in the way of real offensive firepower to neutralize these objectives, meaning that the 4 attack units would have to take them all out. 72 aircraft were simply insufficient to accomplish this in the course of a single strike. High-level bombing was not all that accurate an attack technique. It was performed by 6-plane Chutai flying in formation and dropping together on command, the basic rationale being that if one dropped 6 large bombs on something fairly large itself, perhaps 1 or 2 might actually do some damage. For this reason, level bombing was used against large targets such as runways or shore installations. This left just 36 dive bombers to get at the meat of the matter: the anti-aircraft defences, command and control installations, and other hardened targets that composed the guts of Midway's defences. Clearly, 36 medium-sized bombs weren't going to get the job done. It was almost guaranteed that a second strike would be needed to degrade the atoll's ability to defend itself. In fact, all indications are that Nagumo's staff fully expected a second strike to be required. This had become something of a de facto pattern of the striking force over the last several months. The operations in the Indian Ocean had been executed in a similar fashion, an initial strike launched, with a reserve force held in readiness, followed by the rearming of the reserves for land attack in a subsequent wave. The fact that a second strike would be required wasn't a problem in and of itself, but it pointed to a lack of offensive firepower on the part of the force as a whole. If there were American carriers nearby, Kid Butai didn't really have sufficient firepower to deal with both threats in a timely manner. This indicates a fundamental misapprehension on the part of Combined Fleet's staff of the type of operation it was actually undertaking. They were treating the operation like a raid, à la the attacks made thus far on Pearl Harbor, Port Darwin, Colombo and Trincomalee. But Midway wasn't a raid, it was an invasion, and conducting a proper invasion carried with it an implicit commitment to sustainable action in the face of the enemy. Kid Butai was short on staying power in several key dimensions: logistical support, heavy gun power, if it got involved in a surface action, and particularly numbers of aircraft. Given that a second strike would most likely be required, the question remained as to which aircraft would undertake the action. It will be recalled that during the May War Games, Yamamoto had issued verbal orders to 1st Air Fleet staff to maintain at least half of the striking power of the fleet armed for anti-ship missions. However, It is unclear from the record as to what exact time frame or contingencies the orders pertained. How and when were these reserve aircraft to be used in the likely eventuality that there were no American fleet units present next morning? Was it truly Yamamoto's intent to permanently divide Nagumo's operational aircraft into two halves, a ground attack half and an anti-ship half? Or were his orders merely given to remind Nagumo that the threat of American naval resistance was not to be underestimated? What really were his priorities attacking Midway, or attacking warships should he encounter them? In the lack of written orders, it is impossible to know, although common sense would dictate that any enemy naval force had to be given priority. The overall effect of Yamamoto's instruction, though, was to add another element of inflexibility and uncertainty into the following day's operations. By the time Nagumo issued his morning's orders, it is likely that he, like the main body steaming behind him, had received news of Tanaka's being discovered and then attacked. Admiral Kusaka later stated that they received the communiqué. This was yet another clue that the enemy was fully alerted to the impending Japanese operation. But still, nothing was done to alter the instructions just issued to Kid Butai regarding the coming operations. As the day crept toward evening, the level of tension began ratcheting up a notch. At 16:30, Cruiser Tone opened fire with her main battery in the direction of what appeared to her to be multiple enemy aircraft, bearing almost due south. A shutai of fighters took off from Akagi a minute later, but found nothing. At 16:40, a chagrined Tone reported that it had lost track of the enemy aircraft. Skepticism reigned on Akagi's bridge. Everyone was simply getting a little edgier as the morning of battle drew closer. The men went to general quarters a half-hour after nightfall to change over to nighttime steaming formation. The fleet loosened its columns and moved the carriers into a box. Meanwhile, Haruna moved to the fore so as to have some heavy gun power in the van in the event of an unexpected night fight. Around midnight, shadowy American aircraft would twice be reported by Akagi's jumpy lookouts. Below decks, the majority of the crews had long since gone to bed. Adequate sleep time was enforced after lights out. Everyone, from Nagumo down to the lowliest crewman, knew that tomorrow would be busy. The final act of the evening played out far to the south, where Tanaka's invasion force had its own encounters with shadowy enemy aircraft that turned out to be all too real. Determined to get another blow in against the Japanese as soon as possible, the American air commander, Captain Symard, had ordered 4 radar-equipped Catalinas sent out for a night torpedo attack. Dropping torpedoes was hardly stock in trade for PBYs at this point in the war, but the crews were game for giving it a try. One of the aircraft ran into bad weather and was forced to turn back, but the remaining trio made it to the Japanese convoy by about 01:30. Tanaka's charges were plodding ahead in 2 columns surrounded by the screen. None of the ships were taking evasive maneuvers, and all were neatly silhouetted by the moon as the Americans attacked sequentially from out of the gloomy northeast. The Japanese were caught flat-footed and were slow to react with either helm or anti-aircraft fire, although the latter strengthened noticeably as the attack continued. 2 of the PBYs missed, but the third plane piloted by Ensign Gaylord D. Probst managed to put a torpedo into the port bow of the oiler Akebono Maru at 01:54 local, killing or wounding 23 men. Probst didn't know it, but his jury-rigged Catalina had just pulled off the only successful American torpedo attack aerial or submarine of the entire battle. Akebono Maru, though damaged, shortly rejoined formation and continued on. That ended the night's excitement for Tanaka. Within an hour, the Nagumo force would begin rousing from its slumber to begin preparations for the coming dawn. Part 2. Battle Diary. Thursday, June 541 began with Daiichi Kid Butai doing what it had been doing regularly since the start of the Pacific War arming, fueling, lifting and positioning, spotting its aircraft for a strike. The outcome of these tasks putting planes in the air is so familiar to any reader of World War II naval history that the precursors are largely taken for granted. This is what carriers are meant to do, after all, launch and recover aircraft. Yet 60 years of separation have left the details of exactly how the Japanese operated their carriers so poorly understood that the way they actually fought is no longer entirely understood either. As a result, historians have been in the unenviable position of trying to analyse the Japanese circumstances on 4th of June in terms of analogues based on Western practice. In fact, Japanese carriers did things their own way, which is crucial to understanding how Kid Butai fought and died this day. To be ready for takeoff at 04:30, the day's work had to begin well before dawn. It would involve the prodigious labour of thousands of well-trained crewmen, the majority of whom were not aviators. Indeed, the pilots were still sleeping at around 02:30 when the order Seibiin Okoshi, wake up the crew, was issued for the aircraft mechanics. Stumbling out of their hammocks and narrow bunks deep in the crew spaces, they dressed, stowed their bedding, breakfasted quickly, and then made their way to the hangars. Many of the men, not having had a change of uniform in some while, again because of freshwater concerns, changed into fresh clothes, believing that the code of chivalry required clean clothing for combat. Some of the officers were dressed in blue winter uniforms. Admiral Ugaki had postponed the normal June 1st switch to summer uniforms until further notice. Many of the crewmen, however, were likely in uniform whites or in the cooler South Seas uniform of khaki shorts, shirts, or sometimes just their white undershirts, and floppy hats beloved by Japanese sailors. It wasn't hot now, but they knew it would be later, and there wouldn't be an opportunity to change again during the day's duties. The aircraft dark green, buff and black sat in the harsh electric glare of the hangars. Some of them sported elaborate camouflage patterns, or the bright horizontal tail bands indicating Shutai and Chutai leaders. Many of these aircraft were veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, not to mention the other strikes that Kid Butai had launched across half the breadth of the Pacific. Not surprisingly, some of them were beginning to display the weather-beaten look seemingly universal among well-used naval aircraft of all nations. Worn and chipped paint, dripping hydraulics, and a certain level of idiosyncratic crankiness that persisted in spite of the care they were given. All were now empty, unarmed, and unfueled. There were more than 1,600 mechanics on board Nagumo's 4 carriers. These men, like the pilots of Kid Butai, were among the very best practitioners of their craft in the world. They had worked together for years and were intimately familiar with their charges. Unlike America, where almost every young man had at least a passing acquaintance with internal combustion engines, Japan was far less industrially developed. In 1940, Japan manufactured only 1/80th the number of automobiles that were produced in the United States. Agriculture was still largely performed by hand. As a result, Japanese mechanics did not grow on trees. These men, whether they had been plucked from the inaka, the sticks, or had grown up in the teeming coastal cities, had been trained from the ground up over the course of years. Each mechanic was assigned to a specific plane, just as in the USN, and laboured under the watchful eye of the plane's maintenance petty officer, Seibicho. Unlike American carriers, the Japanese normally did not stow their aircraft on the flight deck in a deck park when not in use. Instead, the hangars were always stuffed. The aircraft were crammed in, practically touching each other, with each plane's location in the hangar indicated by symbols painted on the deck. Each was secured by tether wires to tie down points arranged in a 1.5-metre grid across the deck. Chocks were also placed under the wheels. The hangars smelled strongly of the exotic mix of grease, oil, paint, and all the chemicals and lubricants that go along with the operation of aircraft. No amount of white-gloved fastidiousness was sufficient to remove the odour. On board Cardiv 2, the division's attack planes needed to be fuelled and armed before being moved topside. The crewmen began unrolling metal hoses to the aircraft and pumping fuel into them. Along the hangar walls, a 73-gallon drop tank for each Zero was unfastened from brackets on the bulkheads, attached, and then fuelled. Each plane required between 180 and 235 gallons of fuel, and gassing the aircraft, as well as the Zero's drop tanks, took several minutes apiece. Unlike American carriers, the Japanese hangars were entirely enclosed from the elements. As fueling continued, the faintest hint of aviation gasoline could be detected, mingling with the predominant aroma of paint and motor oils. Overhead, on the port side of the hangar spaces, ventilation systems noisily blew new air in, while the starboard side vents mounted at deck level laboured to suck the noxious fumes away. Simultaneously, armourers were beginning the arduous task of affixing their deadly wares to the attack aircraft. For the initial attack against Midway, Cardiff 2's planes would be armed with Type 80 800 kg land attack bombs. Deep below the waterline, in the bomb storage rooms of Hiryu and Soryu, the men used overhead block and tackle to wrestle the grey-painted weapons onto the lifts that carried them up to the hangars. The bomb lifts terminated on a platform set a metre above deck level. This arrangement prevented deck-hugging gasoline vapours from seeping down the lift shafts and into the magazines. The platform also provided a more convenient means for loading the weapons onto the carts that would carry them to the waiting planes. Each aircraft carrier was equipped with special carts for moving ordnance around. One variety was used for the 242 kilos and 250 ki bombs that were carried by the dive bombers. A second, much heavier cart was used to carry both the Type 80 bombs as well as the 850 kg weight of the Type 91 Modern's 3 torpedoes. Typically, each carrier had enough ordnance carts to rearm one-third of their respective Hikatai at a time, meaning 6 carts for each type of ordnance, and 9 for the 27-strong wing of torpedo bombers on board Kaga. One by one, the 9-foot-long weapons came up the bomb lift. One by one, they were secured to overhead tackle and deposited on the waiting bomb carts. Then Hiryu and Soryu's men rolled their 3-ton packages of cart and bomb from the loading platform to their assigned planes, wending their way through the jammed hangars. Once there, they began the 5-minute process of hoisting the heavy weapon up into place and securing it to the plane's curved ordnance holding brackets, tokaki. Each Type 97 had a hand crank in its starboard wheel well for the plane's ordnance winch. In conjunction with the jacks on the carts, this equipment was used to lift the bomb into the tokaki. Once in place, a carrying harness was attached to the weapon, along with the release and safety wire mechanisms. Next, the bomb's nose and tail fuses were set by an armourer. The weapon was now live, although it couldn't detonate until the tiny fuse propellers had rotated a certain number of times during the weapon's free fall after release. At the completion of this exercise, the arming crews pushed their carts back to the ordnance lift to get another bomb. 3 times they repeated this process before the bombers were ready to be taken up to the deck. They probably started doing this sometime after 03:30. The Zeros were being armed as well. Belts of 7.7mm ammunition were fed into each pair of nose-mounted machine guns, while 60-round canisters were crammed into the wing spaces for the 2 20mm cannons. Additional boxes of ammunition were set out for the day's combat air patrol fighters. There would be many sorties this morning, and each of them would need to be refueled and rearmed as soon as they returned to the mothership. Meanwhile, on Akagi and Kaga, the process had gone somewhat differently. Unlike torpedo bombers, dive bombers were normally armed on the flight deck. The spotting process thus started immediately after the aircraft were fueled. Of all the Japanese carrier planes at Midway, the Type 99 dive bomber was undoubtedly the most difficult to deal with below decks. A large, powerful airplane, it had to be robust enough to survive the harrowing near-vertical dives and gut-wrenching pullouts that were the trademark of expert pilots. Because of the placement of the Type 99's control surfaces and dive brakes, not to mention its need for structural strength, Aichi's designers had decided not to place a folding mechanism too near the centre of the wing. Instead, the Type 99's wings folded very near the tips, making it difficult to stow, tricky to manoeuvre through tight spaces, and a hog of precious parking real estate. The large fixed wingspan also meant that the Type 99 was too big to fit on the diminutive aft elevators of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. As a result, dive bombers were stowed amidships, closer to the larger elevator there. The Type 97 torpedo bombers, although about the same size and weight as the dive bombers, had wings that folded much more compactly, allowing them to use the smaller elevators on the carriers, and so were stowed at the aft end of the ship. Zeros were stowed forward. Spotting a strike for launch was a complex operation, requiring both hard physical labour and quite a bit of precision. Each aircraft had to be individually extracted from the hangars. There wasn't a lot of room to work. The first step was for the crewmen to untether the aircraft and remove its wheel chocks. Then each fully armed and fueled plane, in some cases weighing more than 4 tons, was pushed through the hangar deck and onto an elevator. A team of a dozen or more plane handlers was required to move each aircraft. The trip to the elevator could be several hundred feet in length if the plane had been stowed in the middle of the deck. In the heat of the hangar, such extended pushes were exhausting. When the time came, each plane was shoved onto the elevator as quickly as possible. For the Type 99s, this had to be done very precisely, as they only barely fit on even the larger elevators. During this process, the crew chief intoned the proper commands to ensure the exact positioning of the aircraft. Mijimae-e, forward right. Hidarimae-e, forward left. Yasoro, hold steady. The crew then rode on the elevator together with their plane up to the flight deck to complete topside preparations. Elevator cycle times were crucial to the efficiency of the entire operation, because elevator moves had to be performed sequentially. The problem was aggravated by the Japanese use of dual hangars, one atop the other, necessitating a trip of 30-plus feet, equivalent to a 3-story building each way when lifting an aircraft from the lower hangar deck. Even on the newer carriers like Shokaku, a round trip to this deck could take as much as 40 seconds, including the time necessary to muscle the plane on and off the elevator. On the older Akagi and Kaga, whose elevators were slower, the cycles were even longer. Often, if space was sufficient, the plane's wings were manually unfolded by the pusher team while still on the elevator. Once the plane reached the flight deck, it was rolled by the crew into its place in the spot. This again necessitated pushing a multi-ton aircraft over a considerable distance. Once the aircraft was in position, the wheels were chocked and the wings retethered. The planes were arranged in 3 staggered columns down the length of the flight deck, with the bombers in the rear and the fighters in front. The lead fighter was roughly abreast Akagi's bridge. Had the plane pushers been aware of what was going on around them, they would have seen that Kid Butai's nighttime cruising formation was changing for conducting flight operations. At the head of Cardiff 2, Hiryu was edging off to port. The rearmost ships, Kaga and Soryu, were peeling out of formation to starboard and port respectively, to open the distance between their divisional mates. Kid Butai's formation was becoming a much looser square, with as much as 8,000 metres between the carriers. The evidence suggests that Bat Div 3 formed in column abreast the port flank of the box, while Crew Div 8 did the same to starboard. Nagara remained in the van, and the destroyers spread out as far as 20,000 metres from the carriers. Bat Div 3 and Crew Div 8 were themselves as much as 8,000 to 10,000 metres abeam the carriers. For this reason, the ships of Crew Div 8, as we shall see, were almost always the first main units to sight approaching enemy aircraft. Around the flight deck, the ship's radio aerials were being winched down from their vertical positions into the horizontal mode used during flight operations. These 40-foot masts normally towered over the deck, but they were set on a rotating base that allowed them to be rigged outboard over the water so as not to impede landing operations. In the adjacent gun tubs, the anti-aircraft crews were being assembled and were checking their weapons and ammunition in anticipation of a busy day. All around the deck, the mood was one of bustling optimism. The weather, which had been bad the night before, was still rather dreary. The sea was somewhat rough, and low broken cumulus clouds scudded over the force at between 2,000 and 5,000 feet. The Nagumo force had emerged from the front of the storm system that had bedevilled it previously, and the weather promised to improve the farther south the fleet travelled. However, the broken cloud cover was at best a mixed blessing, because it could conceal the lurking enemy aircraft as well as the fleet. With the carriers done manoeuvring, their designated plane guard destroyers took up their stations. Akagi's bridge crew watched as Nawaki edged into a spot some 700 meters ahead and slightly to starboard of Akagi's bow. She was now in position to perform Tonbo Tsuri, dragonfly fishing, the rescue of crewmen from any aircraft that suffered a mishap during takeoff. On Akagi and Kaga's flight decks, the dive bombers were now in place and being armed from carts. For the morning strike, each would carry a 242 kg Type 98 No. 25 bomb. These high-explosive weapons were designed for use against land targets. Kaga had a bomb lift next to the midships elevator forward that ran all the way to the flight deck, so she loaded her bomb carts on deck. Akagi, whose bomb lift terminated on the lower hangar deck forward, was forced to load her carts below decks and then bring them to the flight deck using the forward aircraft elevator. As with the torpedo planes below, this was accomplished in shifts of 6 planes at a time. It was now Euro 400. Over the carrier intercoms, a trumpet blared, calling the crew to general quarters. Looking out over the water, Akagi's deckhands and gunners could barely make out the outlines of the other 3 carriers in the gloom, but they blinkered their progress to the flagship at intermittent intervals. Even before arming of the dive bombers was complete, the task of warming up aircraft engines began. Because of their internal hangars and lack of natural ventilation, Japanese carriers had no choice but to warm their planes up on the flight deck. This was not an exercise that could be slighted. Radial aircraft engines were complicated, powerful, and built to very tight tolerances. Takeoff required the application of full military power, which placed a great strain on a plane's power plant. Engine failures routinely caused aircraft to abort their missions and either crash or return to base. It was imperative to detect and prevent as many engineering-related aircraft scratches as possible while still on the deck of the carrier, rather than risking the plane and its crew with a hasty takeoff. On each plane, a deck crewman scrambled into the light grey-green cockpit, while another of the deck crew waited at the right side of the engine. Clustered around the plane were damage control personnel with fire extinguishers. On signal, the crewman below cranked the engine with a hand crank. The engine's internal flywheel began groaning and gaining speed. The cockpit man shouted, "Mai Hanare! Get away from the front!" and his crewmate retreated from the danger zone of the propeller. With another shout of "Kontaku!" contact, he engaged the prop with the flywheel. Upon startup, a special mixture of 91-octane starter fuel was fed to the engine to initiate combustion. Coughing white smoke, the strike force's engines roared one by one to life. For several minutes, the power plant was idled at between 1,000 and 1,500 RPM, as hydraulic pressure, oil pressure, fuel pressure, and temperature built up to proper levels. Establishing nominal oil pressure was critical. When a radial engine was shut down, oil tended to collect in the lower cylinders, leaving the upper cylinders dry when the engine was restarted. A proper warm-up was necessary to ensure that oil was flowing correctly to the upper cylinders before full power was applied. During this process, the magnetos, right and left, were switched back and forth, and the propeller pitch control moved from low, fully feathered, to high, full increase RPM. The fuel mixture control was run from lean to rich and back again. When the temperatures and pressures were within proper ranges, the engine would be opened up fully. With the engine at maximum manifold pressure, RPM, and full rich fuel mixture, the gauges were monitored for at least a minute. On land, this required real physical leg strength to accomplish, as the brakes had to be held firmly to keep the plane from moving. On the flight deck, of course, the wheels were still chocked. If the final full power check was done before the engine was properly warmed up, it could blow the engine outright. During this time, the radios and surface controls, rudder, ailerons, horizontal stabilizer, and flaps were also checked. The whole process took no less than 15 minutes, and might take more if the air or engine was particularly cold. Only now was the aircraft finally ready for the rigours of takeoff. During engine warm-up, the flight crews finally made their appearance. Rousted out of bed at around 0245, they had proceeded to their briefing room, TJ in Taikisho. There the men had received their breakfasts from the stewards and consumed it in their seats. The loudspeakers in the ready room blared, "TJ in Seiretsu! Airmen line up!" and the men began climbing the companionway up to the flight deck. Garbed in their heavy brown cotton flight suits and helmets, they emerged into the morning air. They were already sweating. The aviators then crowded round the large blackboards attached to the side of the islands. At around the same time, Commander Fuchida, Akagi's air group leader, decided that he could no longer lie abed in the sick bay, where he was still recovering from his appendectomy. Rising painfully to his feet, he began picking his way through the grey-painted maze that was Akagi. The ship was now in watertight condition, and he had to undog numerous hatches as he made his way, sometimes crawling through the vessel. The process left him exhausted and shaking by the time he finally reached the bridge. Shortly after Fuchida's arrival, Commander Genda, who had come down with a virus in the last few days, also appeared. Visibly ill, he clambered painfully up the ladders from the air platform. Nagumo was particularly touched to see his staff air officer still dressed in his pyjamas as he entered the tiny command space. Putting his arm around Genda, Nagumo made small talk with him as the bustle of launch operations continued below on the flight deck. On board each carrier, the air groups were now being briefed by their respective HIKCH. The weather was expected to be moderate, with broken cloud cover that should not impede the planned attack sequence. It was known that Midway hosted a formidable air group, but it was expected that the strike force's 36-plane-strong fighter escort would sweep enemy fighter opposition aside, as they had during every other operation during the war. Once the attack force was launched, according to the attack plan, Nagumo's carriers would maintain their present course for the next 3.5 hours at a speed of 24 knots. Thereafter, as the wind was basically from the east, the fleet would come to course 45 degrees and steam at 20 knots, allowing the attack force to home on Kid Butai and land sometime after 0830. If these arrangements needed to be changed, a ship would be sent to the locale of the original landing zone to redirect the aircraft. The conclusion of the briefing was usually an opportunity for the ship's air officer to issue a ringing exhortation to the men to do their best. Regardless of the manner of delivery, the crews implicitly understood the importance of the coming action. Each man knew the level of effort and sacrifice that was required of him. After a pause, the Hikchech barked out, "Kakare, get to it!" The men broke into a run for their planes. As they did so, the deck crewmen set the throttles at 1,000 RPM and cleared the waiting aircraft. Simultaneously, each carrier's deck was illuminated in preparation for takeoff. The centre line and edges of the flight deck were indicated by rows of specially hooded white lights designed so that they only shone inward, not outward, where hostile eyes might be watching. The fantail was similarly lit in red, allowing a landing aircraft to judge where the aft end of the flight deck lay.